The wind that crawled down from the Carpathians carried more than snow, it carried the smell of crypts and old velvet. In the valley below, the city had long ago turned its back on the castle that clung to the peak like a tick swollen with centuries of its own blood. Up there, the banners no longer snapped, they hung sodden, embroidered with a family tree so knotted that every branch ended in the same two names, repeated like a curse. The kingdom had no name left that anyone outside its borders dared speak alludingly. Maps ended at the tree line with the words, "Here be dragons," though the only monsters were the ones born in the royal nursery. For 400 years the house of Varkany had married cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, brother to sister, each generation pruning the family tree until only 3 living branches remained, the queen regent, her son the crown prince, and the pale girl raised as a ward in the East Tower who was about to discover she was both niece and granddaughter at once. The law that now rose from the crypt like a corpse sitting upright at its own wake had last been read aloud in 1609, when a king with 6 fingers on each hand took his twin daughters to the altar together. The parchment, inked in blood that had never quite dried to brown, was kept inside a reliquary made from the skull of the first queen who bore her own brother's child. It stated, in letters that seemed to writhe when torchlight touched them, that should the divine strain ever narrow to fewer than 7 adult vessels, the purest remaining women must be joined to the male heir in one ceremony, beneath the ossuary chapel, on the night of the winter solstice when the veil between living and ancestral dead thinned to gauze. The council of violet-eyed nobles gathered at dawn in the Hall of Mirrors, every reflection showing the same elongated skull, the same receding chin that had once been called aristocratic and was now merely evidence. They laid the reliquary on the table and opened it with keys that had been passed from mother to daughter along a line now collapsed into 2 women. The parchment unrolled by itself. No one spoke against it. To speak against it was to admit impurity, and impurity meant the headsman's axe followed by the alchemist's crucible, the body rendered down so its tainted blood would not pollute the mountain springs. So the decree was carried on a cushion of black sable up the winding stairs to the queen's apartments, where she sat before a silver mirror that showed no reflection, only darkness. She read the words without blinking, then pressed the parchment to her lips as though tasting the iron in the ink. Down the corridor, in the East Tower, the girl who still believed herself an orphaned cousin was being measured for a wedding gown cut from the same bolt of spider silk as the queen's, the seamstress whispering that 2 brides must share the same shroud-white fabric so the bloodline would not know which womb it entered first. By dusk the invitations, sealed with wax the color of bruised plums, had been sent to the 12 surviving nobles who could still prove direct descent. They would come, because to refuse was to declare oneself bastard, and bastards were flayed and their skins stretched over drums so the dynasty could hear its own death knell. The ossuary chapel was already being swept clean of bat guano and the small bones of birds that had flown in through the eye sockets of skulls and died there. Workers hung garlands of dried placenta from the ribcage chandeliers. The triple crown, forged from the melted jewelry of every previous incestuous union, was polished until it gleamed like a threat. In the villages far below, doors were bolted though no traveler had climbed the pass in 50 years. Mothers pulled children inside when the wind shifted and carried down the faint sound of hammers preparing the altar. They knew what happened when the royal blood grew too thick, the crops failed, the rivers ran red for a day, and babies were born with their hearts on the outside. The only remedy the mountain had ever accepted was more of the same poison, poured back into itself until the fever broke or the patient died. High above them, in the room where incense burned to cover the smell of stone that had absorbed too many screams, the queen closed the reliquary and smiled at the darkness in her mirror. The girl in the East Tower pressed her forehead to the cold window glass and watched snow begin to fall upward, drawn toward the castle as though the sky itself had decided to attend the wedding. He had always known the woman who came to him at night was not a dream. She moved like someone who had memorized every creak in the floorboards since childhood, slipping through the hidden door behind the tapestry of the flayed saint. The first time, he was 14 and burning with fever, she cooled his temples with lips that tasted of myrrh and iron, then drew the sheets down and taught him what no tutor ever dared. She never spoke, only pressed a finger to his mouth when he tried to ask her name. In the dark her hair was a river of black water, her body both familiar and forbidden, older than is yet somehow ageless. When she left before dawn she left bruises shaped like constellations on his collarbones, proof that he had not imagined her. Over the years the visits grew rarer, dictated by the moon or by some calendar only she understood. Each time she returned thinner, as though something inside her was being carefully hollowed out to make room for a greater hunger. He learned to wait for the faint scent of churchyard lilies that announced her arrival, learned to keep his questions locked behind his teeth. In the palace, daylight belonged to the mother he had never seen, the tragic queen who had supposedly died bringing him into the world. Her portraits showed a woman with his same violet eyes, veiled in mourning that never lifted. He had kissed the painted lips of those portraits as a child, searching for warmth that was not there. At night he kissed living ones that tasted of the same blood. 3 nights before the wedding, the woman came openly, no longer bothering to hide. She stood at the foot of his bed in a robe of dust-colored velvet, the hood thrown back for the first time. Candlelight carved the years across her face, yet the bones beneath were his own, the same sharp cheekbones, the same mouth that looked cruel until it smiled. When she let the robe fall, he saw the faint silver lines low on her belly, the map of a birth that had never been spoken of in daylight. Recognition hit him like a blade between the ribs. He tried to speak her title, mother, but the word turned to ash. She crossed the room in 3 silent steps and placed her palm over his heart as if to still it forever. Her eyes were the exact shade of his own, and in them he saw the same terror he felt, the same revulsion, the same helpless pull toward the abyss they had already half fallen into. She had worn the veil during their nights together not for mystery but for mercy, sparing him the sight of the face he now understood he had been seeking in the dark since the moment he first drew breath. She bent and kissed him once, slowly, the way a woman kisses a man she is about to murder or marry. When she drew back, her lips were wet with his tears or hers, he could no longer tell. Then she gathered her robe and left through the ordinary door this time, the one that led toward the queen's apartments, the hem dragging across the stones like a bridal train rehearsing for the funeral to come. He lay in the dark listening to the castle breathing around him, every stone exhaling centuries of the same secret, until the first pale blade of morning slid between the curtains and found the bruises on his throat shaped like her mouth. The girl had been called Livia since the day they carried her, still slick with birth blood, from the birthing chamber to the east tower. The midwife who cut the cord had wept, though no one ever explained why. From that hour forward she was the queen's ward, an orphan cousin of impeccable lineage, raised on watered wine and lessons in silence. She learned to walk the corridors without sound, to lower her eyes when the queen passed, to accept that some doors were locked because the rooms beyond contained nothing that concerned a girl who was only half royal. She grew tall and narrow, all elbows and throat, with the same violet irises that marked every true Varkany but set in a face still soft enough to bruise. At 19 she had never been touched except by the dressmaker's pins and the occasional cold fingers of the queen arranging her hair for banquets she was never allowed to attend. The palace whispered that she was being kept pure for a foreign alliance, a lie so thin it was almost merciful. In truth she was being kept the way a jeweler keeps a flawed diamond, close, untouched, waiting for the day the setting would hide the crack. On the morning the decree reached the east tower, the seamstress arrived with the wedding gown and a mouth sewn shut by fear. 2 gowns hung on the rack, identical save for the length of the train, one for the queen, one for the ward who was suddenly no longer a ward. Livia laughed at first, a small cracked sound, because surely this was a test of obedience. When the woman only knelt and began pinning the hem, the laughter died. The measurements were taken in silence, the spider silk whispering against skin that had never known anything coarser than baptismal lace. That afternoon they brought her the parchment. She read it alone, kneeling on the cold floor while snow tapped at the window like something trying to warn her. The words crawled across the page in the same blood ink used for death warrants. When she reached the passage defining the second vessel, she felt her stomach fold in on itself. The dates aligned with terrifying precision, the queen's mysterious 9-month retreat to the mountain convent, the fever that had nearly killed her, the single cry that echoed through the corridors one winter night and was never mentioned again. Livia's own birthdate followed 3 days later. She ran to the mirror, ripping the laces of her dress to stare at the body she had never truly looked at. The faint silver seam low on her belly was not, as she had always been told, the mark of a childhood surgery. It was the scar of a royal caesura, the place where she had been cut from the same wound that would tomorrow stand beside her at the altar. The reflection staring back had the queen's cheekbones, the queen's mouth, the queen's eyes that had watched her grow the way a spider watches a fly already caught in the web, waiting for it to ripen. She pressed both hands to the glass until the mirror bled frost beneath her palms. Behind her the wedding gown hung like a flayed skin waiting to be worn. The castle bells began to toll the hour, and each note sounded like a name she had never been allowed to speak: daughter, granddaughter, sister, bride. The ossuary chapel had no windows, only black mirrors set into the walls so the dead could watch the living repeat their mistakes. At midnight, 3 nights before the solstice, the 3 of them were brought down the spiral stair for the rehearsal. The archbishop's voice was a dry rustle, like moth wings against bone. He made them stand in their appointed places, the prince in the center, the queen to his right, Livia to his left. Their shadows merged on the floor until it was impossible to tell whose hand reached for whose throat. Between readings they were left alone with the mirrors and the smell of old marrow. The queen drifted to the high altar and lifted the ceremonial chalice, heavy silver chased with scenes of mothers devouring their own young. She turned it slowly, admiring the craftsmanship, then set it back exactly where it had been. Livia watched the movement and felt the first cold thread of understanding tighten around her ribs. Later, when the priests had gone to pray for strength, Livia found the forbidden library behind the reliquary wall. The book she needed was small, bound in something that had once been pale. The pages crackled like frost. There, between prohibitions against mirrors and warnings about speaking ancestral names backward, was the clause: if one vessel proved impure before the final vow, another could stand proxy, provided the impurity was demonstrated beyond doubt. The traditional demonstration was death by the chalice. She read it 3 times while the candle burned down to a claw. Then she closed the book and went in search of nightshade. The queen, meanwhile, moved through the still corridors with the sureness of someone walking a path worn smooth by centuries of identical footsteps. In the alchemist's chamber she measured drops of something clear and viscous into a crystal vial, counting under her breath. The alchemist himself lay asleep on the floor, mouth open, dreaming of gold that would never be paid. She stoppered the vial, slipped it into the hidden pocket sewn inside her sleeve, and paused only to touch the man's cheek with the tenderness of a mother quieting a child who has seen too much. They met again at dawn in the chapel, separately, each believing the other still asleep. Livia knelt before the altar and tipped her crushed berries into the chalice, stirring until the silver clouded like a storm seen from underwater. The queen arrived minutes later, drawn by the scent of betrayal or instinct, and added her own poison with the same careful turn of the wrist. Neither saw the other. Neither needed to. The chalice accepted both offerings, darkening to the color of old bruises. By the time the priests returned for the second rehearsal, the wine inside was thick enough to coat the tongue like guilt. The queen lifted it first, inhaling the scent of crushed almonds and something sweeter, like rotting lilies. Livia watched her mother's throat work as she swallowed the knowledge that only one of them would leave the crypt alive to lie beneath the prince. Their eyes met across the altar, violet on violet, and for the first time in 19 years the girl saw the queen smile with genuine warmth, the way a wolf smiles when it realizes the trap has 2 jaws. The night of the solstice arrived without moon or stars, as though the sky had turned its face away in disgust. Snow fell upward in slow spirals, drawn toward the castle the way iron filings seek a lodestone. In the crypt beneath the ossuary chapel the temperature rose until breath hung in the air like incense. Every skull in the walls had been turned outward, empty sockets glittered with frost that looked wet. They came down the processional stair in reverse order of purity, first the 12 nobles, faces powdered bone white, then the archbishop carrying the triple crown on a cushion of flayed velvet, then the prince barefoot in black silk that drank the torchlight, then the 2 brides wearing identical gowns stitched from the same bolt so that even God could not tell where one ended and the other began. Their veils were so fine they might have been woven from exhaled breath. Beneath them, the queen's lips were already darkening from the first sip of the chalice taken during the final anointing. Livia's tongue felt thick with the taste of almonds and something metallic that might have been her own blood beginning to slow. At the altar the prince took their hands, his mother's cold and steady, his daughter's trembling so violently he felt it travel the length of his arm like a prophecy. The archbishop began the vows in a language older than mercy. Each time he spoke the family name the bones in the walls answered with a soft clicking, as though the dead were shifting in their niches to get a better view. When the moment came for the crown, the archbishop lifted it high. It was heavier than memory, forged from every wedding ring the dynasty had ever forced onto reluctant fingers, melted and recast so many times that the gold had turned the color of infection. Runes crawled across its surface, spelling out unions that should never have been conceived, let alone consecrated. 3 circlets rose from the central band, linked by chains fine as spider silk. It would rest on all 3 heads at once, binding them into a single creature with one heartbeat and 3 mouths. The prince felt the weight settle first. Metal kissed his temples like frozen lips. His mother's breath hitched beside him, a small, almost tender sound. Then Livia made a noise that belonged to something much younger than 19 being born backward into its own grave. The chains tightened of their own accord, drawing their skulls together until forehead touched forehead in a trinity no scripture had ever sanctioned. Above them the black mirrors shattered at once, glass raining down in slow shards that never quite reached the floor, hanging suspended like dark snow. In the sudden silence the chalice tipped from the altar and rolled, spilling its thickened contents across the stones. Where the wine touched, the bones set into the floor began to sweat blood that steamed in the unnatural heat. Somewhere in the walls a bell that had not rung for 4 centuries gave a single note, low and intimate, the sound a heart makes when it decides to stop. The doors of the crypt sealed with a sigh, stone grinding against stone until no seam remained. Outside, the upward falling snow paused, then reversed again, burying the mountain a little deeper, as though the earth itself wanted to forget what it had just witnessed. Inside, the Triple Crown glowed faintly, drinking the last pure light the bloodline would ever produce. The 3 of them stood locked together, breathing the same breath, tasting the same poison, waiting for the moment when ancestry would finally finish what it had started centuries ago, the perfect circle closing, the snake swallowing its own tail until nothing remained but the echo of a name that had devoured itself entire. The crown had barely settled when the poison, doubled by 2 mothers' hands, chose its own order. Livia's knees buckled first. The chains jerked her upright again, forcing her cheek against the prince's, then against the queen's, a kiss transmitted through metal and bone. Her pulse fluttered like a moth against the inside of her wrists, then slowed to the rhythm of something much older trying to remember how to die. The queen felt it happen and smiled with the small, private satisfaction of a woman who has finally won a game she taught her opponent to play. The prince tried to pull away, but the crown had rooted itself. Thin wires of gold burrowed through skin, seeking the sutures of the skull the way ivy seeks cracks in stone. Blood, bright and sudden, ran down all 3 faces in perfect symmetry, meeting at their joined lips. He tasted his mother, his daughter, himself, all at once, the same iron note repeated until it became a chord no human throat was meant to sing. Livia's eyes rolled white. In the instant before the poison finished its work she saw the chapel clearly for the first time. Every skull in the walls had turned into a mirror, and in each mirror stood the same child, sometimes a boy, sometimes a girl, with violet eyes and a mouth sewn shut by golden thread. The children reached out, palms pressed to the inside of the bone as though trying to push through into the world that had refused them birth. She understood then that the dynasty had never been dying, it had been pregnant with itself for centuries, waiting for this single night to deliver its final miscarriage. The queen's hand found the prince's throat beneath the chains. Her fingers were steady, almost loving. She had carried him once, hidden him beneath layers of velvet and lies, now she carried him again, this time toward silence. He felt her thumb settle over the place where his pulse still fought, and he forgave her because forgiveness was the last impurity left to burn away. A wind rose inside the sealed crypt, though no door had opened. It smelled of milk and grave dirt. The torches reversed, flames pointing downward like stalactites of blue fire. The spilled chalice rolled back to the altar of its own accord, upright and empty, waiting. The crown tightened again, and the 3 bodies folded inward until it was impossible to tell whose ribs cracked first. When the last heartbeat, whose it was no longer mattered, finally stopped, the mirrors bled outward. Black glass poured across the floor and up the walls, swallowing skulls, garlands, the flayed velvet cushion, everything except the triple crown, which now hung suspended in the dark, glowing with the soft bioluminescence of deep-sea creatures that have never seen sun. Inside its circlets, 3 skulls rested cheek to cheek to cheek, grinning the same lipless grin, teeth fused into a single circle. Somewhere far below, the mountain exhaled. Snow ceased falling upward and simply vanished, as though the sky had decided amnesia was kinder than witness. In the villages, mothers woke with the taste of lilies in their mouths and knew, without knowing how, that the castle was finally quiet. They did not open their doors. They did not need to. The wind that came down at dawn carried no scent of crypts, no echo of bells, only the clean, thin smell of stone that has forgotten it was ever warm. High above, in the ossuary chapel that no longer had an entrance, the crown pulsed once, like a heart remembering its first beat, then settled into the perfect stillness of something that has completed itself by ceasing to exist. Years later, when the forest had swallowed the last switchback of the road and the castle was only a rumor that made shepherds cross themselves, a girl with violet eyes came down the mountain carrying a bundle wrapped in wolfskin. No one saw her arrive. She was simply there one morning at the edge of the market square, barefoot despite the frost, hair black as fresh tar, mouth set in a line too old for the face around it. She never spoke her name. The village priest tried to take her in, but when he reached for the bundle she opened it herself and showed him what lay inside, a circlet of gold so thin it looked like a ring of frozen breath, yet heavy enough that her thin arms trembled holding it. Inside the circle, 3 small teeth, 1 milk, 2 permanent, were fused side by side, roots braided together like lovers who refuse to be parted even in death. The priest dropped to his knees in the mud. He had heard the stories, of course, but stories rot quickly in daylight. This did not rot. It gleamed. When he tried to pray, the teeth chattered once, a sound like dice in a dead man's hand, and the girl closed the bundle again. She lived on the outskirts after that, in a hut built from stones that sweated when the moon was full. Children dared one another to peek through the cracks and saw her sitting always in the same position, knees drawn up, the wolfskin across her lap, rocking though there was nothing in her arms. Sometimes she sang under her breath, a lullaby in a language no one recognized yet everyone understood, 3 notes repeated, rising and falling like a single heartbeat split 3 ways. Women who had lost babies in the night began leaving bowls of milk on her doorstep. The milk was always gone by morning, the bowls licked clean with a tongue that left no print. Crops ceased failing. The river ran clear again. Children were born with ordinary eyes and 10 fingers each, and the old ones said the mountain had finally been paid in full. Once a year, on the winter solstice, the girl climbed back up the hidden path no one else could find. She stayed 3 days. On the 3rd night the wind carried down a sound like many throats trying to speak with one mouth, a low humming that made dogs whine and candles burn blue. When she returned her hair had grown longer, thick enough to hide her face entirely, and the bundle seemed heavier, as though something inside was slowly learning weight. No one ever asked what she did up there. They only watched her pass, thin as a shadow cast by bone, carrying the last pure relic of a dynasty that had eaten itself into extinction and still, somehow, refused to die. The teeth in the crown clicked softly with every step she took, keeping time to a pulse that belonged to no single heart, counting down or counting up, no one could tell. In the spring, violets grew where her bare feet had trod, dark as bruises and sweet as rot. People picked them carefully, because if you pressed one to your lips you could taste iron and milk and something older, something that remembered being 3 people wearing 1 crown in a room with no doors, waiting for the world to forget them so completely that they could finally begin again. The girl was never seen to age. Decades passed, the village became a town, the town a small city with electric lights that flickered whenever she walked beneath them. Empires rose and crumbled beyond the mountains, but she remained the same height, the same thinness, hair now long enough to trail behind her like a black river when the wind rose. Only the bundle changed, the wolfskin rotted away, replaced by oilcloth, then by nothing at all. She carried the crown openly in the end, balanced on her outstretched palms as though offering it to anyone brave enough to take it. No one ever was. On the night the first train reached the valley, she stood at the new station and watched the locomotive exhale steam the color of old bones. The engineer saw her and crossed himself so violently his cap fell onto the tracks. She smiled, the first time anyone could remember, and the train's whistle came out wrong, 3 descending notes that sounded like a lullaby played backward. After that, the railway company rerouted the line. Progress, they learned, prefers not to look directly at certain survivals. She still climbed the mountain every solstice, but now she left footprints that filled with dark water no frost could freeze. Hunters who followed them out of curiosity found the path simply ended at a wall of living rock that had never been there before. On the other side, if they pressed their ears to the stone, they heard breathing, slow, tidal, the way the earth itself might breathe if it dreamed of wombs and crowns. In the city archives there is a photograph taken in 1953, a May Day parade, banners bright, children waving paper flags. In the background, half out of frame, stands a woman in a gray dress that might once have been white. Her face is turned away, but the line of her throat and the fall of her hair are unmistakable. Beside her, too small to be noticed unless you know what to look for, a second figure, no larger than a child, wears the same dress, the same hair, the same posture. The photographer swore he saw only one person when he pressed the shutter. When the negative was developed, both were there, and between them the faint outline of a third. Old women began leaving bowls of milk again, though they no longer remembered why. The milk disappeared overnight, and in its place grew circles of violets that opened at midnight and closed before dawn, petals soft as the inside of a mouth. Those who picked them dreamed of a room with no doors where three skulls wearing one crown sang in voices made of snow and rust. She was last seen on the evening the first snow fell upward again, 87 years to the night since the crypt sealed. She walked to the center of the new bridge, set the crown on the parapet, and stepped over. No splash, no cry. The crown remained, glowing faintly, teeth clicking like a clock running down. By morning the bridge was gone, the river had shifted course, and the mountain wore a fresh scar no map would ever acknowledge. Only the violets kept growing, darker every year, until one spring they opened violet black and never closed again. Children born after the day sometimes wake speaking a language no scholar recognizes, 3 notes repeated, rising and falling like a heartbeat learning how to divide itself forever. Their mothers find milk bowls empty on the windowsill and do not ask questions. Some debts, they understand without being told, are paid forward until the world itself is old enough to carry them. The century turned twice more, and still the crown waited. It had been moved only once, in 1989, when workmen widening the road uncovered a circle of violets growing in perfect geometry around a lump of gold half buried in frost. They pried it free with pickaxes, laughing at peasant superstition, until the youngest touched the fused teeth and began bleeding from the eyes. After that the foreman wrapped it in his coat and carried it to the city museum himself, driving one-handed because the thing grew warm against his ribs like a second heart trying to remember rhythm. The curator, a woman whose own eyes were the pale gray of winter rivers, recognized it at once from forbidden sketches in the diocesan archives. She locked it in a vault beneath the building and forbade photographs, but photographs happened anyway. Within a week every darkroom in the city produced the same flaw, 3 shadows where only one object sat beneath the developer's red lamp. The negatives were destroyed, then the prints, then the cameras, but the images kept appearing on fogged windows, on the surface of coffee left too long, on the inside of eyelids when people tried to sleep. Children began disappearing on solstice nights. Not many, 1 every 7 years, just enough that the pattern was noticed only by those who already knew to look. They were always found again at dawn, barefoot in the square, holding stems of violets that bled when broken. They spoke of a woman with hair long enough to rope the moon, and of 2 smaller figures who walked inside her shadow the way fish swim inside a whale. They described a room that smelled of milk and rust, where a crown floated above the floor and sang with 3 mouths that had no tongues. Then they forgot, overnight, and the violets withered to black lace in their fists. The curator grew thin. She stopped eating anything that came from a breast, milk, cheese, butter, because the taste reminded her of something she refused to name. At night she descended to the vault and sat before the case, watching the crown turn slowly though nothing touched it. Sometimes she pressed her palm to the glass and felt an answering pressure, gentle as a child asking to be let in or let out, impossible to tell which. On the 100th solstice since the sealing, the lights in the museum failed at the exact moment snow began falling upward again. Security cameras recorded only static laced with 3 heartbeats that were not quite synchronized. When power returned, the vault door hung open and the case was empty. Footprints, small, bare, perfect, led up the service stairs, across the roof, and ended at the edge where the city lights dropped away into darkness. No body was ever found, no splash recorded in the river far below. Only the violets remained, spreading now beyond the mountains, across borders that had ceased to matter. They grow in perfect circles wherever 3 people once tried to become one and almost succeeded. At night, if you walk between the petals, you can hear the faint click of teeth learning how to speak with a single voice made of many. The song has no words yet, only hunger, patient as stone, certain as winter returning to the place it was born. The violets crossed oceans inside the cuffs of refugees, inside the lining of suitcases carried by people fleeing wars they did not start. They took root in cracked concrete, in the thin soil of refugee camps, in the forgotten corners of cities that believed themselves new. Wherever 3 women shared one room, or one child was born with eyes too old for the face around them, the flowers opened black in the night and refused to close again. Botanists called them an invasive mutation and tried to burn them. The flames only made the petals curl like lips tasting smoke, then straighten again, darker. In 2023, a girl in Sao Paulo woke speaking the 3-note lullaby backward. Her mother recorded it on a phone and posted it without thinking. Within hours the clip had been taken down by every platform, yet the audio lived on, passed hand to hand like contraband prayer. Listeners reported milk appearing in empty cups, mirrors fogging with breath that spelled no name, the sudden smell of crypt lilies in bedrooms that had never held flowers. Children who heard it began drawing the same symbol on walls and desks, a circle divided into 3 unequal parts, joined by chains so thin they looked like cracks. The crown itself was never recovered, but fragments began turning up in the strangest places, a single gold link in the stomach of a fish caught off Iceland, a tooth fused to a wedding ring pawned in Marrakesh, a circlet no larger than a bracelet washed ashore on Easter Island wearing barnacles shaped like tiny skulls. Each piece bled when separated from the rest, slow drops that refused to dry and tasted of iron, milk, and snow. In the mountains where the castle had stood, satellites now register a perfect circular depression filled with cloud that never disperses. Thermal imaging shows 3 heat signatures moving slowly beneath the mist, always the same distance apart, always the same temperature, 36.6 degrees Celsius, the warmth of a womb that has forgotten how to let go. Drones sent to investigate lose signal the moment they cross the perimeter. When they are recovered days later, the memory cards contain only one still image, taken from above, 3 figures in white, heads bowed together beneath something that glints like frozen breath. Women who have never met begin dreaming the same dream, a corridor of black mirrors leading to a door that opens inward on itself. Behind it waits a girl with hair long enough to braid the night, holding out a crown that is also a cradle. She never asks them to take it, she only waits, patient as glaciers, certain that one day someone will be tired enough, lonely enough, hungry enough for belonging to step forward and complete the circle again. The violets are in every city now. They grow between subway tracks, along hospital corridors, inside the cracks of courthouse steps where marriages are dissolved. At night they exhale a scent that makes strangers weep without knowing why. Somewhere a woman touches the faint silver scar low on her belly and feels, for the first time, the weight of a crown she has never seen settle gently onto her sleeping head. The song has almost learned its 4th note. The year the violets finally learned the 4th note, every mirror in the world fogged at once. Not dramatically, no screams, no bleeding glass, just a soft exhalation that left the surface clouded for exactly 3 heartbeats. In that brief blindness people saw, or remembered they had always seen, the reflection of someone standing just behind them, a woman with black hair down to her ankles, eyes the color of winter dusk, mouth sewn shut by a thread of gold. When vision cleared she was gone, but the thread remained, glinting across the viewer's own lips like a promise or a wound. Pregnancies began lasting exactly 9 months and 3 days. No doctor could explain the extra 72 hours, the fetuses simply refused to descend until the 4th note finished sounding in their blood. Midwives reported that when the infant finally emerged it opened its eyes immediately and looked not at the mother but past her, toward a corner of the room where nothing stood. Then it smiled with a mouth that already held too many teeth. The crown reassembled itself without human hands. Fragments flew home across oceans and continents, the gold link from the fish's belly, the tooth from the pond ring, the barnacled circlet from the Pacific shore, each piece arriving at the old mountain on the same night the snow began falling upward again, only this time the snow never touched ground. It hung suspended in perfect spheres that reflected 3 faces inside every drop. On the morning of the winter solstice the cloud that had hidden the castle for a century thinned just enough for satellites to capture one clear image. The depression in the earth had become a bowl of black glass, and at its center stood the complete triple crown, now large enough to crown a giant or a god. 3 figures waited beneath it, naked, hairless, sexless, skin translucent as frost on a window pane. Their skulls were fused at the temples in a perfect equilateral triangle, and where their mouths should have been was only smooth skin stretched over a single shared heartbeat. At 3:17 Universal Time coordinated every speaker on Earth, phones, radios, televisions, cochlear implants, the tiny diaphragms inside children's toys, emitted the lullaby in full. For notes now, the fourth lower than any human throat should reach, a sound like the planet itself clearing its throat after centuries of silence. Milk boiled in sealed cartons. Violets opened indoors, on carpets, inside locked drawers, inside the sealed caskets of people who had died believing the story was over. Women who had never been pregnant woke with the taste of lilies and iron in their mouths and the weight of a crown pressing gentle grooves into their sleeping skulls. They rose, barefoot, and began walking. Direction did not matter. Every road now curved imperceptibly toward the mountain. Some carried babies that had not existed the night before. Others carried only the memory of a child-shaped absence shaped exactly like themselves. By nightfall the bowl of black glass was full of them, millions, barefoot, silent, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the suspended snow. The crown lowered slowly, chains singing as they lengthened to accommodate every head at once. When the first circlet touched the first scalp, the fourth note resolved into a chord so pure it had no need of ears to be heard. The mirrors never cleared again. They show only one image now, a single face made of countless faces, eyes violet and depthless, mouth finally open, singing the lullaby forward and backward at the same time. The circle is complete. The debt is paid. The mountain exhales, and the world, very gently, begins to forget it was ever more than one thing wearing many skins.